Imagine a world where a single city dictates the destiny of millions, stretching its power across 3 continents. A civilization that mastered concrete, constructed aqueducts that still flow today, and engineered a political system that would become the blueprint for modern democracy, all while brutally enslaving nations and cheering as men fought to the death for amusement. It is a paradox of unparalleled brilliance and terrifying darkness. This is the story of a tiny village on the banks of the Tiber River that refused to die, growing into an empire that defined the course of human history. This is the story of Rome. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. I am Alex, your guide through the annals of history, where we separate myth from reality and uncover the true stories of the past. Today, we embark on a monumental journey through the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. We are going to walk the streets of the ancient Forum, stand on the decks of triremes in the Mediterranean, and witness the clash of armies that decided the fate of the world. It is a saga of ambition, betrayal, genius, and sheer will. If you enjoy exploring the great civilizations of the past, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Also, take a moment to leave a comment below telling me which era of history you want me to cover next. Your feedback helps shape the stories we tell together. Now, let us step back in time to the very beginning, where legend and history are inextricably intertwined. The story of Rome begins not with marble and gold, but with mud and blood, deep in the mists of antiquity. Archaeology tells us that people were living on the hills of Rome as early as the 10th century before Christ. These were simple farmers and shepherds living in thatched huts, eking out a living on the humid, mosquito-infested plains of Latium. But history loves a good origin story, and the Romans were no exception. They told tales of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, sons of the war god Mars and a human priestess. According to legend, they were cast into the Tiber River to die, only to be miraculously saved by a she-wolf who suckled them until a shepherd found them. While the she-wolf is a fascinating myth, the reality of Rome's foundation is likely rooted in a much more practical and violent event. The early Roman society was a collection of scattered tribes that needed to unite for survival. The site was strategic. The Tiber River provided a route to the sea, but the hills offered a defensive advantage against pirates and rival warlords. It was a crossroads of trade, and where there is trade, there is power. However, Rome was not always the master of its own fate. In its early centuries, the city fell under the sway of the Etruscans, a sophisticated civilization from the north who brought with them advanced engineering, art, and religious rituals. The Etruscan kings ruled Rome for generations, turning it from a collection of huts into a real city. They built the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, which drained the marshy valleys between the hills, allowing the construction of the Roman Forum. This engineering marvel still exists today, a silent testament to their skill. But the Roman spirit was restless, and they chafed under foreign rule. The turning point came with the overthrow of the Tarquin monarchy in the year 509 before Christ. The Romans, led by the influential Lucius Junius Brutus, revolted against the tyrannical king Tarquin the Proud. They drove the king and his family into exile, declaring that Rome would never again bow to a single ruler. This was the birth of the Roman Republic, a government designed to prevent the rise of another king. They established a system of checks and balances, electing 2 consuls each year who could veto each other's decisions. It was a radical experiment in self-governance, born from a hatred of monarchy. But the new republic faced immediate peril. Its enemies sensed weakness. Surrounding tribes like the Sabines and the Volsci saw the chaos of the revolution as an opportunity to attack. In these desperate early years, Rome needed a unifying symbol, a defender of the city. They found him in a man named Horatius Cocles. When the Etruscan army, attempting to restore the monarchy, attacked the Sublician Bridge, Horatius stood alone at the narrow entrance of the bridge. With 2 companions by his side, he held the entire army at bay, while his fellow Romans cut the bridge down behind him. As the bridge collapsed, Horatius plunged into the churning waters of the Tiber under a hail of arrows, miraculously swimming to safety. This act of suicidal bravery became the cornerstone of Roman identity. It was not enough to be strong. One had to be willing to die for the state. Virtus, or manly courage, became the highest ideal. Yet, the greatest threat to the young republic came from within. The struggle between the wealthy aristocrats, known as patricians, and the common citizens, the plebeians, threatened to tear the city apart. The patricians held all the power, owning the best land and controlling the government. The plebeians, who made up the vast majority of the army and the workforce, had no political voice and were often crushed by debt. In the year 494 before Christ, the plebeians reached their breaking point. Refusing to fight in Rome's wars until their grievances were addressed, they seceded from the city, marching to the Sacred Mount outside the walls. The Roman economy and military paralyzed, the Senate was forced to negotiate. This was the beginning of the conflict of the orders, a 300-year struggle that would gradually reshape Rome. The plebeians won the right to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, who had the power to protect them from unjust laws. It was a slow, painful grind toward equality, but it forged a sense of unity. The plebeians fought for Rome because Rome was now fighting for them. This internal stability allowed Rome to look outward. The Republic began a relentless campaign of expansion, conquering the neighboring Latin tribes and absorbing their lands. But Rome was not content with just Italy. They looked across the waters to the island of Sicily, a breadbasket that would bring them into conflict with their first true rival. The Phoenician city of Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia, was a maritime powerhouse. They controlled the trade routes of the Mediterranean and possessed a vast empire of their own. When Rome and Carthage clashed over Sicily, it sparked the First Punic War. It was a clash of 2 giants. Rome was a land power, possessing a formidable army. Carthage was a sea power, with the most advanced navy in the world. Desperate to win, the Romans did something unthinkable. They captured a Carthaginian warship that had washed ashore and used it as a template to build their own fleet. Within months, a nation of farmers had constructed a navy. But they knew they lacked the sailing skills of the Carthaginians. To compensate, they invented a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a heavy spike that would crash into the enemy deck, locking the ships together. This turned a sea battle into a land battle, allowing Roman infantry to swarm across and slaughter the Carthaginian sailors. It was an ingenuity born of desperation. The Romans suffered terrible losses at sea, including storms that wiped out entire fleets, but they refused to quit. They raised new fleets, paid for by the citizens themselves, and eventually won the war, capturing Sicily as their first province. Rome had arrived on the world stage, but this victory came with a heavy price. The First Punic War planted a seed of hatred in the mind of a Carthaginian general who would become Rome's worst nightmare. The peace between Rome and Carthage was fragile, merely a pause in the storm. Into this tense silence stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with terror. Hannibal Barca. He was a brilliant tactician, a man of immense charisma, and he carried a burning hatred for Rome, instilled in him by his father, Hamilcar. The Second Punic War began when Hannibal laid siege to the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Roman ally. Rome declared war, expecting to fight in Spain. They had no idea that Hannibal planned to bring the war to their doorstep. Hannibal did the impossible. He led an army of 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants on a harrowing march through the Alps. It was a journey of almost insurmountable odds. The cold was biting, the mountain paths were treacherous, and hostile tribesmen ambushed them constantly. They lost thousands of men and nearly all their elephants. But Hannibal led his surviving troops down into the Po Valley of Italy, appearing like a vengeful ghost where no enemy was expected. The Roman response was predictable and disastrous. They sent a massive army to stop him at the Trebia River, confident in their numbers. But Hannibal was a master of deception. He used his Numidian cavalry to lure the Romans into a trap, while his infantry held the line. The cold rivers sapped the strength of the Romans before the battle even began. It was a slaughter. But the true masterpiece of Hannibal's career was at Cannae, in the year 216 before Christ. Rome assembled an unprecedented force, 80,000 men, the largest army in the city's history. They were determined to crush the invader. Hannibal, outnumbered almost 2-to-1, deployed his troops in a crescent formation, bulging forward in the center. As the Romans pushed against his center, the line buckled, but it did not break. The Romans thought they were winning and poured more men into the gap. Then Hannibal sprang the trap. The flanks of his army swung around, closing the pincers on the Roman legions. The African infantry on the wings turned inward, and the cavalry smashed into the Roman rear. The Romans were surrounded. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. For hours, Roman soldiers were cut down where they stood. It is estimated that 50,000 to 70,000 Romans died that day, a rate of killing that is almost impossible to comprehend. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. The road to Rome was open. Panic seized the city. The streets were filled with the wailing of mothers and the prayers of the terrified. Surely, Rome would fall now. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. He lacked the siege equipment to take the city, and he hoped that Rome's allies would abandon them. He waited. He waited for years, camping in the Italian countryside, fighting skirmishes, but he never delivered the final blow. This delay gave Rome time to regroup. They adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding open battle with Hannibal while wearing him down. The Romans refused to surrender. They embodied a grim determination, famously reported in the Senate when the dictator Fabius Maximus refused to engage Hannibal directly, earning him the nickname the Delayer. The turning point came when a young Roman commander named Scipio Africanus decided to take the fight to the enemy. He realized that Rome could never defeat Hannibal in Italy. Instead, he launched an invasion of Carthage itself. This forced Hannibal to abandon his campaign in Italy and rush home to defend his city. The two titans finally met at the Battle of Zama in the year 202 before Christ. This time, Scipio had learned from Hannibal. He neutralized Hannibal's war elephants by allowing his troops to open lanes in their formation for the animals to run through without harm. His cavalry outmatched the Carthaginians on the flanks. In the center, the infantry clashed with brutal intensity. In the end, Scipio's tactics prevailed. the Romans destroyed the Carthaginian army. Hannibal survived, escaped, and advised Carthage to sue for peace. Carthage was stripped of its navy, its empire, and its independence. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The victory at Zama transformed Rome. They were no longer just a regional power, they were an imperial superpower. The wealth from the conquered territories poured into the city, funding massive public works and fueling a new class of wealthy merchants. But this victory also marked the beginning of the end for the Republic. The traditional Roman values of austerity and service to the state began to erode under the weight of unlimited wealth and power. Generals returning from the conquests became richer and more popular than the Senate. The legions, once a citizen army defending their homes, began to swear allegiance to their commanders, who paid them and led them to glory. The Republic was sick. The social fabric was tearing apart as the gap between the rich and the poor widened. Slaves poured into Italy from the conquered territories, working the vast estates of the aristocrats and displacing the free Roman farmers. The countryside emptied, and the cities filled with a dispossessed, angry underclass. Rome needed a new system, or a new man, to control the chaos that their own success had created. And in the East, a new threat was rising, one that would require the might of Rome to subdue the heirs of Alexander the Great. The Roman appetite for conquest was insatiable. With Carthage defeated, the Senate turned its hungry eyes toward the East, to the fragmented kingdoms that had once been the empire of Alexander the Great. The Hellenistic world was rich, cultured, but divided. It was a prize too tempting for Rome to resist. They began to intervene in the political squabbles of the Greek kingdoms, ostensibly to protect their allies, but in reality to expand their sphere of influence. The most powerful of these eastern kingdoms was Macedonia. Under King Philip V, and later his son Perseus, Macedonia challenged Roman dominance. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Pydna in the year 168 before Christ. It was a clash of two very different military traditions, the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legion. The phalanx was a block of spearmen, bristling with pikes 6 meters long. It was an impenetrable wall of steel, devastating in a frontal assault. The legions, however, were more flexible. They were divided into maniples, small units that could move independently and adapt to the terrain. At Pydna, the Macedonians advanced uphill, their phalanx losing its tight formation on the uneven ground. The Romans exploited the gaps, hacking apart the rigid Macedonian blocks with their shorter swords. The Macedonian army was crushed, and the kingdom was dissolved. Rome's victory in the East brought an influx of art, philosophy, and treasure that would forever change Roman culture. Educated Greek slaves tutored the children of the Roman elite. Roman art began to mimic Greek styles. But there was also a darker side to this conquest. Rome treated the Greek cities with arrogance and brutality. In the year 146 before Christ, Rome achieved a dark symmetry. In a single year, they destroyed both Carthage and Corinth. The destruction of Corinth was an act of calculated savagery. The city was looted, burned to the ground, and its inhabitants were sold into slavery. Rome sent a message. No power, east or west, could stand against the might of the Senate and people of Rome. However, as the empire expanded, the Roman soldier became a stranger to his own country. Campaigns lasted years, spanning continents. A farmer might leave his plow to fight in Spain or Greece, only to return years later and find his land ruined or bought by a wealthy neighbor. This led to the rise of a man named Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus was a young nobleman who witnessed the suffering of the common people during his service in Spain. He was deeply moved by the poverty and the shrinking class of citizen soldiers who were the backbone of the state. In 133 before Christ, he was elected tribune of the plebs and proposed a radical land reform bill. He wanted to redistribute public land to the poor, to create a new generation of landowners who could serve in the army. The Senate, comprised of the wealthy landowners who would lose their illegally held land, was furious. They blocked him at every turn. In a desperate move to save his bill, Tiberius bypassed the Senate entirely and took the legislation directly to the plebeian assembly. This was constitutional but a severe breach of tradition. He claimed his colleague in the tribunate, Octavius, was betraying the people by blocking the bill, and had him removed from office, a precedent that terrified the establishment. The land reform passed, but the atmosphere in Rome turned toxic. On the day of Tiberius's re-election campaign, a mob of senators and their followers, led by the Pontifex Maximus, armed themselves with clubs and staves. They stormed the Capitol, and in a chaotic scene of brutal violence, Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death. It was the first time blood had been spilled in the heart of Rome over political conflict. The Republic had crossed a river of no return. Political murder had become a tool of the state. 10 years later, Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus attempted to continue his brother's work. He was a gifted orator, perhaps even more charismatic than Tiberius. He passed even broader reforms, including subsidizing grain for the poor, a policy that would have massive long-term consequences for the Roman economy. But he also pushed the limits of his power, establishing colonies and proposing citizenship for Rome's Italian allies. This was too much for the Senate. They suspended the constitution and declared a state of emergency, granting the consul the power to do whatever was necessary to save the state. Cornered, Gaius Gracchus ordered a servant to kill him, fearing capture. A purge followed. 3,000 of his supporters were executed without trial. The Gracchi brothers were not warlords. They were reformers who tried to fix the Republic from within. But their deaths exposed a fatal flaw in the Roman system. There was no legal mechanism to peacefully resolve class conflict when one side controlled all the money and the other controlled the streets. The violence at home was mirrored by violence abroad. In the years following the Gracchi, Rome faced a massive slave uprising known as the Servile War. Thousands of slaves, led by a gladiator named Spartacus, defeated several Roman armies and terrorized the Italian peninsula. Spartacus was a Thracian, a man of incredible physical strength and leadership. He wanted to march his army out of Italy to freedom, but his followers, drunk on success and revenge, turned back south. The Senate turned the war over to a wealthy young commander named Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was ruthless. He offered to pay for his own army and promised to crush the revolt. He revived the ancient and brutal punishment of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 soldiers in his legions for cowardice, to instill fear and discipline. He slowly tightened the noose around Spartacus, building a massive wall across the peninsula to trap him. In the final battle, Spartacus was killed, and 6,000 of his captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a gruesome warning to anyone who dared to challenge Rome. The Republic was drowning in blood. The institutions of the state were collapsing under the weight of corruption and violence. The army was no longer a force of citizens, it was becoming a tool of ambitious generals who used it to seize power. The stage was set for the rise of the first warlords, men who would realize that the sword was mightier than the Senate. It was time for the strong men to take center stage. From the ashes of the Republic's moral decay rose two men who would set the world on fire: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. They represent the two sides of the coin of destruction that would ultimately doom the Republic. Marius was a novus homo, a new man, a self-made military genius who rose from poverty to the highest office in the land. Sulla was an aristocrat, a patrician who embodied the traditional ruling class. Their rivalry began with the military. Marius transformed the Roman army. He abolished the property requirement for service, opening the legions to the landless poor. This created a professional army where soldiers served for 20 years, looking to their general for payment and, upon retirement, a grant of land. The soldiers became loyal to the man who could promise them a future, not to the abstract idea of Rome. It was a shift that would have catastrophic consequences. Marius's star rose during the threat of the Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones, who were migrating south and had annihilated several Roman armies. The people of Rome were terrified. They elected Marius consul year after year, breaking all traditions to deal with the threat. Marius trained his new professional army with iron discipline. He met the Teutones at Aquae Sextia and destroyed them completely. Then, at Vercelli, he crushed the Cimbri. Rome was saved, and Marius was hailed as the third founder of Rome. But as Marius faded into old age, a new crisis erupted in the east. King Mithridates of Pontus, a brilliant and ambitious ruler, launched a war to drive the Romans out of Asia Minor. He incited a rebellion that resulted in the death of 80,000 Roman and Italian civilians in a single day, a massacre that shocked the Roman world. The Senate gave the command to Sulla. Marius, envious and unwilling to fade away, used his political connections to have the command transferred to himself. It was an illegal move, but it worked. Sulla, a man of cold, calculated ruthlessness, did not accept this. He gathered his legions, who were camped outside the city walls, waiting to embark for the east. And he did the unthinkable. He marched on Rome. No Roman general had ever led an army against the city before. It was an act of war against the state. Sulla's forces entered the city, and blood ran in the streets. Marius fled, and Sulla passed laws to strengthen the Senate and limit the power of the tribunes, aiming to turn back the clock. Then he left to fight Mithridates in the east. Sulla's campaign in the east was brutal but effective. He laid siege to Athens, the cradle of democracy, which had sided with Mithridates. When the city fell, he destroyed it. He eventually forced Mithridates to sue for peace and packed his coffers with the plunder of the east. But during his absence, Marius returned. The old man, now in his 70s, teamed up with the radical Cinna. They seized control of Rome and launched a purge of Sulla's supporters. Marius died a few weeks after taking power, but the terror continued under Cinna. When Sulla returned to Italy, he was not coming to negotiate. He was coming for revenge. The civil war that followed was short but decisive. Sulla landed at Brundisium and marched on Rome for a second time. He defeated the popular forces in a series of bloody battles. Upon entering Rome, he declared himself dictator with absolute power. There were no limits on his term, no appeals to his decisions. Sulla began the proscriptions, a state-sanctioned reign of terror. Lists of names were posted in the forum. Anyone on the list was an enemy of the state, their property confiscated, and their execution rewarded. People killed their personal enemies just to claim the reward. The sons of proscribed men were barred from political office. It was a systematic attempt to wipe out the opposing party. Thousands were killed, including a young Julius Caesar who was a nephew of Marius and the son-in-law of Cinna. Sulla pardoned him only after the intervention of mutual friends, famously remarking that he saw many Mariuses in the young Caesar. Sulla eventually stepped down from the dictatorship and retired to private life, a move that shocked everyone. He died shortly after, having saved the Republic by destroying its soul. But the cycle of violence did not stop. The precedents Sulla set, marching on Rome, using the army for political gain, and purging enemies, were lessons learned by a younger generation of ambitious men. The Republic was a hollow shell, held together only by the memories of the past. Two men emerged from the chaos, bound by blood and ambition, who would finally put the Republic out of its misery: Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar. Pompey was a brilliant military commander who had started his career as a supporter of Sulla. He won great victories in Spain and in the East, famously cleaning up the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months. He conquered the remnant of the Seleucid Empire and annexed Syria, bringing the borders of Rome to the Parthian frontier. He returned to Rome a hero, demanding a triumph and land for his veterans. Julius Caesar, meanwhile, was a man of different genius. He was not as militarily gifted as Pompey at first, but he possessed a charisma that could enchant a crowd. He was a brilliant writer and a daring politician. He used his wealth to buy popularity, staging elaborate games and distributing grain. Together with a wealthy banker named Crassus, they formed the first triumvirate, a secret alliance that controlled Roman politics. Pompey brought the soldiers, Crassus brought the money, and Caesar brought the people. The triumvirate divided the spoils of the state. Pompey settled in the east. Crassus was given the command against Parthia, and Caesar was given the governorship of Illyricum and Gaul. It was in Gaul that Caesar would forge his legend. Over the course of 8 years, he conducted a war of conquest that was nothing short of genocidal. He fought the Gallic tribes with relentless efficiency, crossing the Rhine into Germania, and even making a brief raid on the mysterious island of Britannia. His account of these wars, the commentaries, were written in the third person and sent back to Rome, acting as brilliant propaganda. The Romans read about his bravery and his victories with bated breath. He conquered a territory the size of modern France, killing 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million. The loot he sent back to Rome was astronomical, making him the wealthiest man in the Republic. Caesar's fame threatened the delicate balance of the triumvirate. Crassus, seeking his own glory, launched an ill-fated invasion of Parthia. At the Battle of Carrhae, his army was annihilated. Crassus was killed, and his severed head was used as a prop in a Greek play by the Parthian king. With Crassus gone, the balance broke. Pompey, jealous of Caesar's growing power and influenced by the Senate, turned against his former ally. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a political death sentence. Caesar knew that if he returned without his army, he would be prosecuted and destroyed. He faced a choice at a small stream called the Rubicon, the border of Italy. To cross it with an army was treason. To not cross was surrender. "The die is cast," Caesar is reported to have said. He led 1 legion across the river, marching toward Rome. It was a lightning strike. Pompey and the Senate, unprepared for Caesar's speed, fled Italy to regroup in the east. Caesar seized the capital and then pursued Pompey to Greece. The two met at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey had twice as many men and controlled the high ground, but Caesar was a gambler. He saw a weakness in Pompey's lines and committed his reserves, launching a desperate attack that broke the enemy cavalry. Pompey's army collapsed. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary. But the Egyptian pharaoh, fearing Caesar's wrath, assassinated Pompey as he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, he was presented with Pompey's head. The great conqueror wept. He then became involved in the Egyptian civil war, supporting the beautiful and cunning Cleopatra against her brother. Their alliance would become legendary. With Pompey dead and his enemies scattered, Caesar returned to Rome to absolute power. He was named dictator for life. He began sweeping reforms, including a new calendar and plans for a massive public works program. But for a city that had grown to fear kings, the title dictator for life was too much. A group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, formed a conspiracy. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March in the year 44 before Christ, they surrounded Caesar in the Senate House and stabbed him 23 times. Caesar fell at the foot of Pompey's statue. The conspirators believed that by killing the tyrant, they would restore the Republic. But they had misread the mood of the people. They did not love the Republic. They loved Caesar. The assassination did not save the Republic. It doomed it completely. The death of Caesar plunged Rome into a new and even more deadly phase of civil war. The power vacuum was immediately filled by three men: Caesar's right-hand man Mark Antony, Caesar's adopted son and heir Octavian, and a trusted general named Lepidus. They formed the Second Triumvirate, officially sanctioned by the Senate to restore order. But unlike the First Triumvirate, this was an openly dictatorial body. They initiated a new wave of proscriptions, hunting down and executing their enemies. Cicero, the voice of the Republic and the greatest orator of his time, was on the list. He was beheaded, and his hands and tongue were nailed to the rostra in the Forum, a grim symbol of the death of free speech. Once the internal enemies were eliminated, the triumvirs turned on each other. Lepidus was the weakest link and was easily marginalized. That left Mark Antony and Octavian to divide the world. Octavian took the west, while Antony took the east to deal with the Parthian threat and to secure the resources he needed. In the east, Antony met Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. They became lovers and allies, and together they planned a massive invasion of the eastern provinces to carve out their own empire. Octavian used this relationship to paint Antony as a traitor who had gone native, a man who was enslaving Rome to a foreign queen. He read Antony's will, which left vast territories to Cleopatra and requested to be buried beside her in Alexandria to the Roman people. The propaganda war was highly effective. The Senate stripped Antony of his titles and declared war on Cleopatra. The stage was set for the final conflict of the Roman Republic. The forces of Octavian and Antony met at the Battle of Actium in the year 31 before Christ. It was a naval battle fought off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet was commanded by his brilliant friend and general, Agrippa. Antony and Cleopatra had a larger fleet, but their ships were heavy and difficult to maneuver. The battle was a stalemate for much of the day until the wind shifted in favor of Octavian. Seeing the battle turn against them, Cleopatra's squadron broke through the line and fled to open sea. Antony, in a fit of passion and despair, abandoned his fleet and followed her. The rest of his army, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered. Octavian was now the master of the Roman world. He chased Antony and Cleopatra back to Egypt. When his forces closed in on Alexandria, both lovers committed suicide. Antony fell on his sword, and Cleopatra, according to legend, let an asp bite her. Octavian entered Egypt and made it a province of Rome. The last of the Hellenistic kingdoms had fallen. He returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as the savior of the state. He had avenged Caesar, defeated the enemies of Rome, and ended the decades of bloodshed. But he was a shrewd politician. He knew that the Romans hated the name king, so he walked a careful line of constitutional sleight of hand. He gave up his extraordinary powers to the Senate and the people, technically restoring the Republic. But he kept control of the legions, the most dangerous provinces, and the treasury. He held the title of princeps, meaning first citizen. The Senate, terrified of another civil war, heaped titles upon him: Augustus, the revered one; Imperator, commander; Pater Patriae, father of the country. It was a fiction that everyone believed. The Republic was dead in all but name. Rome was now an empire, ruled by one man. Augustus ushered in a period known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a time of unprecedented stability and economic growth. Augustus reformed the bureaucracy, created a permanent police force and fire brigade in Rome, and built magnificent new temples and public buildings. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. But there was a dark side to this golden age. The arts flourished, but freedom of speech was muted. Poets like Virgil and Ovid wrote great works, often glorifying the regime, or in Ovid's case, getting exiled for offending the emperor. Augustus created a system of surveillance, using spies to monitor the elite. Morality laws were passed to force traditional family values on the population. Augustus ruled for over 40 years. When he died in the year 14 after Christ, the transition of power was seamless. He had designated his stepson Tiberius as his heir. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had begun. Rome had entered the era of the emperors. The days of the Republic, with its squabbling factions and its occasional flashes of true liberty, were gone forever, replaced by the absolute power of one man, for better or for worse. The rule of the first emperors was a roller coaster of tyranny, insanity, and unexpected brilliance. Tiberius, who followed Augustus, was a capable but deeply paranoid man. He retreated to the island of Capri, where he indulged in debauchery while leaving the administration of the empire to his prefect, Sejanus. Sejanus used this power to eliminate his enemies, plotting against Tiberius's own family. Eventually, Tiberius turned on him, and Sejanus was executed. But Tiberius never returned to Rome. He left the empire in a state of fear and depression. When Tiberius died, he was succeeded by Caligula, the son of a beloved war hero who had died young. Caligula's first months were promising. He lowered taxes and released political prisoners. But then he fell severely ill. When he recovered, his personality had completely changed. He became a monster. Ancient historians accuse him of sleeping with his sisters and attempting to make his horse a consul. He built a pontoon bridge across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride his horse across it. He squandered the treasury on lavish games and absurd projects. His reign of terror ended after just 4 years, when the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, assassinated him in a corridor of the palace. The Praetorian Guard then discovered that Caligula's uncle, Claudius, was hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified. They dragged him out and proclaimed him emperor. Claudius was a man with a limp and a stutter, whom his family had tried to hide in the background his entire life, but he turned out to be a surprisingly capable administrator. Claudius conquered Britain, a feat that Julius Caesar had failed to achieve. He expanded the bureaucracy, built a new harbor at Ostia to feed the growing city, and began the construction of the massive aqueduct system that still serves Rome today. He also began the reclamation of the Fucine Lake, a massive engineering project. However, his personal life was a disaster. His wives, particularly the infamous Messalina, manipulated him and shamed him. Eventually, he married his niece, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina had a son from a previous marriage named Nero, and she was determined to see him become emperor. Agrippina is widely believed to have poisoned Claudius with a dish of poisoned mushrooms to clear the way for her son. Nero, just 16 years old when he took the throne, started well. He was guided by the philosopher Seneca and the prefect Burrus. The first 5 years of his reign were known as the Quinquennium Neronis, a time of good government. Nero focused on arts, diplomacy, and trade. But he soon grew tired of advice. He had his mother killed because she controlled him too much. He then kicked his pregnant wife to death in a fit of rage. Nero wanted to be an actor and a musician, performing in public, which was considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. He forced the Roman elite to watch his long, tedious performances, under pain of death. But the defining event of Nero's reign was the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights, destroying much of the city. Legend says Nero fiddled while Rome burned, playing the lyre and singing about the destruction of Troy. While this is likely an exaggeration, it is true that he used the land cleared by the fire to build a massive palace for himself, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Rumors swirled that he had started the fire himself to clear the land. To deflect the blame, Nero blamed the Christians, a small, obscure religious sect. He initiated the first state persecution of Christians, torturing and executing them in horrific ways, including burning them as human torches in his gardens. Eventually, the governors of the provinces rebelled. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Nero, abandoned by his guards and his friends, fled Rome and eventually committed suicide, lamenting, "What an artist the world is losing in me." With Nero's death, the line of Julius Caesar and Augustus came to an end. The year 69, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, saw generals Galba, Otho, and Vitellius rapidly rise and fall, each assassinated by their own troops or rivals. The final victor was Vespasian, a tough, no-nonsense general who had been busy putting down the Jewish revolt. Vespasian brought stability and founded the Flavian dynasty. He began the construction of the Colosseum, the symbol of Rome's power and brutality, financed by the loot from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. His son, Titus, completed the Colosseum and is remembered for his kindness during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which buried Pompeii. The Flavians brought the empire back from the brink, but the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. The empire was too big for one man to control alone. The army was becoming the kingmaker, and on the frontiers, a new breed of warrior was beginning to test the Roman defenses. The era of the good emperors was approaching, a time when the Roman Empire would reach its greatest height, but the foundations were already shaking. Imagine looking down from a hilltop 2,000 years ago. In every direction, the Roman eagle flies. From the rain-swept moors of Britain in the north to the scorching sands of the Sahara in the south, from the rugged mountains of Spain in the west to the fertile plains of the Euphrates in the east. The Roman Empire encompassed nearly 2 million square miles and ruled over 60 million people, roughly 1/5 of the world's population. This was the peak of Roman civilization, a golden age known as the era of the 5 good emperors. It began with Nerva, a senator chosen by the Senate who adopted his successor, a capable general named Trajan. This system of adoption, rather than hereditary succession, ensured that the most competent men led the empire. Trajan was a soldier emperor, and under his rule, the empire reached its maximum territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, modern-day Romania, which provided Rome with vast gold mines. He also fought a successful war against the Parthians, briefly annexing Armenia and Mesopotamia. Trajan was beloved by the people. He was a man of the people, simple and direct. He instituted social welfare programs for the poor, known as the alimenta, which were funded by the state. He expanded the Roman road network and built a massive new forum in Rome, the ruins of which still stand today. He was so successful that the Senate granted him the title Optimus Princeps, meaning best ruler. But Trajan's successor, Hadrian, realized that the empire was overextended. He immediately pulled the troops back from Mesopotamia and Armenia, believing the borders were indefensible. Instead, he focused on consolidation. He built a massive wall across the north of Britain, 73 miles long, marking the northern limit of the empire and keeping the barbarian tribes of Scotland at bay. Hadrian spent most of his reign traveling through the provinces, inspecting the troops and improving infrastructure. He standardized the law, codifying the Roman legal system into a cohesive whole. Hadrian's Wall stands today as a monument to Roman military engineering. Following Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, a reign of peace and prosperity. He is often forgotten because, unlike the others, he didn't fight any major wars or build massive monuments. He simply ruled well, kept the peace, and managed the economy. He is often compared to the Roman equivalent of President Eisenhower, a calm, stabilizing presence. He was succeeded by Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. Marcus Aurelius is one of history's most fascinating figures. He was a Stoic philosopher who wrote the Meditations, a series of personal journals that are still read today for their wisdom on how to live a good life. But despite his philosophical mind, he spent almost his entire reign fighting wars on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes known as the Marcomanni and the Quadi. It was during these dark, cold campaigns that he wrote his Meditations. The Stoic philosophy teaches that one must accept fate and do one's duty without complaint. Marcus Aurelius embodied this. He ruled with wisdom and justice, but he made one fatal mistake. He broke the tradition of adopting the best man for the job and named his son Commodus as his heir. Commodus was not a philosopher, he was a megalomaniac. He loved the gladiatorial games and even fought in the arena himself, dressed as Hercules. He was unstable and cruel. He eventually was strangled in the bath by a wrestler, an ignoble end to the era of the good emperors. With Commodus, the decline began. The 3rd century became a time of crisis. Generals were declared emperor by their troops and then assassinated. Civil war became endemic. The economy collapsed under the weight of hyperinflation. The frontiers were breached by a new wave of barbarian invasions, the Goths and the Alemanni. Out of this chaos rose a man named Diocletian. He realized the empire was too large for one person to rule. He introduced the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He divided the empire into East and West, each ruled by an Augustus and a junior Caesar. This system stabilized the borders for a time. Diocletian also fixed the economy by freezing prices and wages, creating a command economy that was deeply unpopular but arguably saved the state. But the real turning point came with Constantine the Great. He became emperor after a civil war and made a decision that would change the world forever. In the year 312, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a vision. He saw a cross in the sky and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. He won the battle and became the sole ruler of the empire. Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which granted tolerance to Christianity. He eventually converted himself. He built a new capital, Nova Roma, on the site of the ancient city of Byzantium. It was strategically located on the Bosporus Strait, controlling the trade routes between Europe and Asia. He named it Constantinople. Slowly, the center of power shifted eastward. The Western Empire, based in Rome, grew weaker and weaker. The legions were no longer Roman citizens. They were barbarian mercenaries fighting for gold. The Huns, led by Attila, swept across Europe like a scythe, terrorizing the Roman world. In the year 410, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by King Alaric, sacked the city of Rome. For 3 days, they looted the capital. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome had fallen to an enemy. The shock waves reverberated through the ancient world. Finally, in the year 476, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer led a rebellion against the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. He deposed the emperor and sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, declaring that there was no need for a separate emperor in the West. The Roman Empire in the West was finished. But Rome did not die. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire in all but name, continued for another 1,000 years. In the West, Roman law, language, architecture, and culture became the foundation of medieval Europe. The Catholic Church preserved Latin literacy and Roman administration. The ideals of the Republic lived on in the Renaissance and the founding of modern democracies. So, was Rome a force for good or evil? It was both. It brought peace, order, and technology to a chaotic world, but it did so through brutal conquest and slavery. It was a civilization of contradictions, just like us. It is a mirror that reflects our own highest aspirations and our darkest impulses. That is the story of Rome. It is a story that reminds us that even the greatest empires are fragile, that power is fleeting, and that history is written by the victors, but remembered by the people. Which Roman emperor do you find most impressive or controversial? Was it the brilliant Julius Caesar, the philosopher Marcus Aurelius, or perhaps the mad Caligula? Write your answer in the comments below. I love reading your historical debates. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the sands of time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Roman Empire, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends who love history. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to join our community of history enthusiasts. Until next time, stay curious, and remember that the past is never truly dead. It's not even past.